Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're going to be diving into something incredibly fascinating, how one nation, India, essentially became a massive historical sanctuary for the world's persecuted communities. And this isn't just a geography lesson. It's honestly a pretty profound story about human resilience and, well, radical hospitality. So let's jump right in.
To really wrap our heads around how this happened, we have to start with a core idea. There's this ancient Sanskrit phrase from a classical text called the Hitopadesha, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It translates to, for the noble-minded, the whole world is family. Think about that for a second. That wasn't just some nice-sounding quote. It was a deeply held societal ethos that actually shaped centuries of history.
Which brings us to the big question for today's Explainer. What exactly makes a society a true home for the persecuted? Seriously, how do massive groups of people who are literally fleeing for their lives not just find a temporary safe haven, but actually stick around, integrate, and thrive in a completely foreign land over hundreds or even thousands of years? Keep that in the back of your mind as we unpack how cultural assimilation actually works in practice.
You can really grasp how deep this cultural identity goes when we look back at Swami Vivekananda at the historic 1893 World Parliament of Religions. During his famous speech there, he told this global audience with so much pride that his nation had sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions from all nations of the earth. And he specifically called out two ancient groups to prove his point: the Israelites and the Zoroastrians. Let's actually look at the incredible story of the Zoroastrians.
Okay, picture this. It's the 7th century. The Parsis, who are followers of the ancient Zoroastrian faith, are facing absolute devastation. Their mighty Sassanid Empire in Persia has just fallen to Arab forces, and they are dealing with forced conversions, heavy religious taxes, and the destruction of their sacred fire temples. It's a nightmare. So, they had to make a really terrifying choice: stay and face total marginalization, or pack up and flee across the Arabian Sea into the complete unknown. They chose to flee, eventually washing up on India's western coast in what is now modern-day Gujarat.
What happened right after they arrived is captured in this brilliant local legend, and honestly, it is the ultimate metaphor for perfect cultural integration. So the story goes, the Parsis approached the local ruler, Raja Jadirana, to ask for a place to stay. But they can't speak a word of each other's language. So the Raja just presents them with a jug filled to the absolute brim with milk. He's silently saying, "Look, my kingdom is totally full, there's no room for anyone else." In response, a Parsi wise man takes a single spoonful of sugar and gently stirs it into the milk without spilling a single drop. The message was clear: we're going to sweeten your society, but we won't displace a single person. The Raja was totally won over, and the Parsis found their home.
What's wild, though, is that this integration wasn't just based on a clever, polite agreement. It was actually built on these ancient shared roots. You can trace this right down to the language. The Parsis' ancient sacred language, Old Avestan, and the local Vedic Sanskrit share some striking grammatical features and word roots. For instance, a divine drink is called soma in Vedic and homa in Avestan. A sacrifice is yajna in Sanskrit and yasna in Avestan. It's almost like a giant puzzle fitting together. Those deep, pre-existing cultural connections made it so much easier to weave the Parsis seamlessly into the fabric of Indian society.
Jumping to a totally different but equally amazing story. Jewish communities like the Beni Israel started arriving in India way back, around 1750 BCE. Get this, some accounts say they originally arrived by surviving shipwrecks on the Konkan coast. Later waves settled further south near Kochi, where local kings literally just gave them land, free of charge, to build their synagogues. The Raja of Kochi even made a promise that the land was theirs as long as the world, sun and moon endure. I mean, centuries later, in 1805, you even had the Maharaja of Travancore gifting a gold crown for the Jewish Torah. That level of respect is pretty mind-blowing.
And the historical records from that era are just beautiful to look at. The stunning, vibrant interiors of the Kochi synagogues show how freely and openly they were able to practice their faith. And when you look at old photographs of historic Jewish families in late 19th century Mumbai, you notice something amazing: their clothing. It perfectly highlights how Jewish traditions seamlessly blended with Indian sartorial styles. They kept their religious identity 100% intact, all while deeply embedding themselves into the local culture over centuries. It's a true blending of worlds.
We see the exact same pattern playing out with early Christian arrivals. The traditions you'd see at a modern Syriac Christian wedding ceremony in India actually have roots going back over a millennia and a half. Starting around the 4th century CE, Syriac Christians were dealing with intense persecution. Over in the Roman Empire, they were being branded as heretics, and in the Persian Empire, they were suspected of being Roman spies. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place, right? So to escape all that hostility, they traveled along the ancient trade routes all the way eastward to the Malabar coast in present-day Kerala, finding a sanctuary where they could finally live, work, and worship without looking over their shoulders.
Now, to be clear, it wasn't just refugees who came over. We really have to contrast those groups with the folks who arrived voluntarily, driven by trade and commerce, because they integrated just as beautifully. Arab merchants arrived as peaceful traders starting around the 7th century, swapping spices in Kerala, marrying into local families, and they actually helped build India's oldest mosque, the Cheraman Juma Masjid. Similarly, you had Armenian merchants trading spices, who later became super influential during the 16th century Mughal Empire. Emperor Akbar gave them permission to build churches, and some of them incredibly rose to become chief justices and even royal doctors in the Mughal court.
But of course, we also have to acknowledge a darker chapter, with folks who were brought over by force, yet still managed to forge an unbelievable legacy. Take the Sidi community, for example. The Sidis are of African origin, and they were brought to India as enslaved people by Arab, Portuguese, and British traders anywhere between the 7th and 19th centuries. Despite that tragic, horrific beginning, over the generations, they fused their distinct African drumming and dance traditions with adopted local languages and religions, whether that was Hinduism, Islam, or Christianity. Talk about incredible resilience. They created this wholly unique blended cultural identity that fiercely survives today.
So the through line here is that this sanctuary concept, it literally spans almost every major belief system you can think of. Take the Baha'i faith. In the mid-19th century, followers of this brand new religion faced severe persecution over in Persia simply for preaching unity among all people and harmony between different religions. Seeking safety, some of the very first Baha'is fled eastward. In India, they found a safe haven where they could spread their message of love and unity, eventually growing into a massive, thriving community that, today, is comprised mostly of native Indians. Okay, let's just step back for a second and look at the whole timeline. Seeing it all laid out like this really proves that this sanctuary status isn't just some ancient, dusty myth. It's an ongoing, living ethos that comes right up into the modern era. We go from the Beni Israel arriving way back around 1750 BCE to the Syriac Christians in the 4th century, the Parsis in the 8th century, all the way up to recent history with Polish orphans in 1942 and Tibetan refugees in 1959. Actually, let's zoom in on those last two, because they are profoundly moving.
During the absolute nightmare of World War II, thousands of Polish families were completely torn apart, leaving so many children orphaned. Well, Digvijay Singhji Ranjit Singhji, who was the Maharaja of Nawanagar, and by the way, he is still remembered lovingly in Poland today as the Good Maharaja, was deeply moved by this. He didn't just send money. He mobilized the Red Cross and physically rescued around 1,000 Polish orphans, bringing them all the way to a stay in Gujarat between 1942 and 1946. He gave them food, medical care, and genuinely gave them a home away from home until the war ended. There is literally a monument to him in Warsaw right now honoring this incredible act of humanity. No way you can hear that and not get a little bit emotional.
And finally, fast forward just a bit to 1959 with the Tibetan refugees. Following an uprising in Lhasa against the Chinese presence, the 14th Dalai Lama was advised to flee across the Himalayas, and he was quickly granted asylum in India. Today, with the help of the government, the Tibetan community has been beautifully rehabilitated. They've established thriving settlements and built massive monasteries, especially down in Karnataka, that perfectly mirror the original ones back in Tibet. They've preserved their culture, their Buddhism, and get this, their traditional medical system, called Sowa Rigpa, has actually been formally integrated into India's own national traditional healthcare programs. They are an incredibly vibrant part of society today.
So, we're at the end of our explainer. We've just traveled through centuries of history, seeing over and over how vulnerable people became the sugar that sweetened the milk of a new society, without ever overflowing the cup. It really is a beautiful testament to human integration and what we're capable of. So I want to leave you with this thought. Look around your own community today. Who are the displaced folks, the migrants, or the refugees? And more importantly, how can we make sure that they too are given the chance to be the sugar in the milk for our shared future? Really think about that. Thanks for learning with me on this explainer, and I'll catch you guys next time.